Colorado, 1887. There is a mathematics to grief, but it is a liar. It counts the days since a voice went quiet, the years a house has been too large for its occupant, the empty spaces at a dinner table, but it never counts the weight of the silence itself, and that is where the truth of the thing resides. Elias Thorne had stopped doing the arithmetic 5 years back. He knew the number, of course. He knew it had been 1,825 days, give or take, for the turning of the earth, since he had buried his Martha. But the number meant less than the feeling that settled in his bones each morning when he woke to a cold bed, the silence in the kitchen where her humming used to be the first sound of the day. His ranch was a good one, nestled in a valley that caught the sun just right. The land was honest. It gave back what you put into it, with no sentiment and no malice. It was a language Elias understood. He understood the language of fence posts and barbed wire, of a sick calf's lowing, of the sky's mood before a storm. He had 100 acres of hay meadow and twice that in pasture, more than enough for the herd he ran. It was a life's work, and it had been their life's work. Now it was just his. The house was too large. Martha had designed it, sketching it on butcher paper at the old kitchen table in their first little cabin. It had 2 stories, a wide porch, and windows that looked out onto the mountains she had loved. For the 2 of them, it had been a kingdom. For one, it was a museum of echoes. His dog Gus, a mutt with the loyalty of a saint and the ears of a mule, was his only constant companion. Gus didn't mind the silence. He would lie on the rag rug before the cold hearth, his tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the floorboards, a living metronome in a house where time had otherwise lost its beat. Elias had stopped expecting things. He expected the sun to rise, the seasons to turn, the work to be there each morning. He did not expect joy. He did not expect company. He did not expect the quiet ache in his chest to ever truly fade. It had become a part of him, like a limp he had learned to walk with. He was 52 years old, a man made of work and memory, and he believed his story had already been written. The rest was just living out the epilogue. Then, one afternoon in late summer, something changed. He was on his porch, mending a bridle, the leather worn and familiar in his hands. Gus was asleep at his feet, twitching in some dream of chasing rabbits. Elias looked up, his gaze sweeping the valley as it did 100 times a day, a habit of watching his borders, and he saw it. A wagon, tired and dusty, pulled by a single sway-backed horse, was making its way up the rutted track to the old Miller cabin. The Miller place had been empty for a decade. It was a small, sad-looking thing, barely more than a homesteader's shack, its back broken by a winter of heavy snow years ago. No one had bothered to fix it. No one had wanted the trouble. He watched as the wagon creaked to a halt. A figure climbed down. Not a family, not a pair of brothers looking for a steak. It was a woman, alone. From this distance he could tell little more. She moved with a weariness that he recognized, the slow, deliberate motion of someone who has come a long way and has no clear place to go. She stood for a long time just looking at the dilapidated cabin, her hands on her hips. Then she got to work. Elias said nothing. He watched for a while longer, then went back to his bridle. It was not his business. People came and went in the West. Most did not last. The land had a way of sorting them. He saw her over the next few days, always from a distance. He saw her patching the roof with salvaged planks. He saw her clearing the weeds that had choked the small yard. He saw her trying to wrestle a fallen section of fence back into place along the creek that divided their properties. She worked from sunup to sundown. She worked with a steady, relentless energy that spoke of desperation, or maybe just determination. He wasn't sure which. One morning he was riding his own fence line, checking for breaks before moving the herd to the upper pasture. He came to the creek and saw her there, struggling with a post that would not hold in the soft, damp earth. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair escaping its bun in damp tendrils. She was using a rock to try and hammer the post deeper, a futile, frustrating task. He pulled his horse to a stop on his side of the water. Gus, who trotted alongside him everywhere, sat on his haunches and watched with a curious tilt of his head. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She looked up, her hands frozen around the rock. She was younger than he had thought, maybe 30, though her eyes held a tiredness that made her seem older. They were clear, direct eyes. There was no artifice in them. "That post won't set there," Elias said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Ground's too soft." She straightened up, wiping a hand across her forehead, leaving another streak of mud. "I can see that." Her voice was low and carried a hint of a place farther east. "But it's where the fence was. Doesn't mean it's where it ought to be. You need to sink a brace post higher up the bank, then run your wire down to it." He said it simply, a statement of fact. She looked from the post to the bank he indicated, considering. She gave a short, sharp nod. "Thank you." She did not ask for help. She did not complain. She simply accepted the information. He found himself hesitating. The old Elias, the man he was before Martha, would have offered to help. The man he was now kept to himself. But he saw the blisters on her hands, the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders. "You looking for work?" The question surprised him as much as it probably surprised her. Her gaze snapped back to his. It was sharp, assessing. "I am. I need fences mended, north pasture, pay $1 a day." She didn't smile, but some of the tension left her face. "My name is Clara May. When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Come to the main house." He nudged his horse and rode on without another word, Gus trotting to keep up. He did not look back. But he felt her eyes on him all the way up the rise. He had hired help. A woman, alone. It was not sensible. He told himself it was just for a few days, just until the fence was done. Clara May arrived the next morning as the sun was just clearing the eastern peaks. He was in the barn. He heard her footsteps, light but sure on the hard-packed earth. "Morning," she said from the doorway. He pointed to a set of post-hole diggers and a roll of wire. "Everything you need is there. The wagon is loaded with posts. You know how to handle a team?" "Yes." He watched her hitch the 2 sturdy workhorses to the wagon. Her movements were economical and sure. She didn't talk to the horses in a cooing, sweet way some people did. She spoke to them in low, firm commands they seemed to understand perfectly. She had a competence about her that was plain and unadorned. It was like watching a good carpenter or a skilled blacksmith. It was a kind of honesty. For the next week, she worked on the north pasture fence. Elias worked on his own chores, but he found his eyes drifting toward the distant figure on the hillside. She worked tirelessly. She never stopped early. She never complained about the heat or the hard ground. Each evening, she would return the wagon and the team, report on the work she had done in a few brief sentences, and then walk the mile back to her dilapidated cabin. He started leaving a jug of cold water from his well near the fence line where she was working. He didn't say anything about it. The next day, the empty jug would be waiting for him, rinsed clean. One evening, he came back to his porch after bringing the herd in. Sitting on the top step was a small glass jar. It was filled with a dark, rich purple substance, chokecherry jam. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The next morning, he made 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. He didn't know why, he just did. He drank his own, and the second cup sat on the stove, growing cold. He did it again the next day. It became a small, unspoken ritual, a gesture to an empty room. He had to go to town for supplies that Friday. The town of Harmony was little more than a wide spot in the road with a general store, a blacksmith, and a church. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor of the store, knew everything about everyone. "Elias," Abernathy said, leaning his ample belly against the counter. "Been a while. Needed salt licks. And coffee." Abernathy measured out the coffee beans, his movements slow and deliberate. "Heard you hired on some help." "Up at the Miller place." Elias just grunted, arranging sacks of feed in his wagon bed. "A woman," Abernathy continued, undeterred. "Folks are talking. Says she's a hard worker, though. Keeps to herself." He paused, then lowered his voice. "Says Silas Croft has been by her cabin a time or two, in his fancy buggy." Elias froze. Silas Croft was the wealthiest rancher in the county. He had a sprawling operation on the other side of the valley and a reputation for being as smooth as a river stone and just as cold. He was a man who collected things, land, cattle, and, it was said, pretty women who found themselves in a tight spot. "That's so," Elias said. His voice was flat. "Just so," Abernathy confirmed, nodding. "A woman alone, a place like that. She'll need help. Croft's the kind of man who offers help, but the price is always high." He looked at Elias, a knowing glint in his eye. "Some help is just help, though. Some is just kindness." Elias paid for his goods and left without another word. The ride home was quiet, but his mind was not. He thought of Silas Croft's expensive clothes and easy smile. He thought of Clara May's tired eyes and blistered hands. He felt a low, unfamiliar anger burn in his gut. It was an old, protective instinct he thought had died with Martha. It's a funny thing to know a story is being told about you, to feel the eyes of your neighbors and friends piecing together a narrative you haven't even written for yourself yet. What country are you listening from today? I'd be grateful if you drop it in the comments below. It means everything to know where this voice is reaching, what corner of the world we're sharing this quiet moment in. Thank you for that. Now, let's get back to the story, because Elias Thorne is about to discover that some actions don't require thought, they just require heart. And a man who has forgotten he has one is about to be reminded. The fence work was done. Clara had stretched the last strand of wire, neat and taut as a fiddle string. Elias had paid her, and he'd expected that to be the end of it. He had no more work for her, not really. He could always find something, but he was a man who lived by necessities, and he told himself her presence was not a necessity. But she did not leave. The smoke still rose from her chimney in the mornings. He saw her tending a small garden she had carved out of the stubborn earth. He saw her walking along the creek. They would sometimes see each other at a distance and raise a hand in a brief, silent greeting. The valley felt different with her in it, less empty. Then the first cold snap of autumn hit, a sudden, sharp-toothed thing that came down from the mountains overnight. It stole the last of the warmth from the air and left a lacework of frost on the windows. Elias, up before dawn as always, felt the bite of it as he stepped onto his porch. He built up the fire in his own stove, the wood catching and crackling with a welcome roar. As the sky lightened, he looked over toward the Miller cabin. There was no smoke. A thin plume should have been rising from her chimney by now. The cold was deep, the kind that got into your bones. Her cabin was drafty, poorly insulated. He knew she had been gathering fallen wood, but she wouldn't have had time to build up a proper winter supply. He waited. He drank his coffee. He watched. Still nothing. A knot of worry, cold and tight as the frost on the ground, formed in his stomach. He tried to dismiss it. It wasn't his concern. She was a grown woman, but the image of that thin, dark line of smoke against the pale morning sky was a powerful one. Its absence was a shout in the quiet. He didn't make a decision. His body just moved. He went to his woodshed, where cords of seasoned oak and pine were stacked neat and high, dry and ready. He loaded a wheelbarrow until it was heaped full. The iron wheel groaned in the cold as he pushed it out of the yard and down the track toward her cabin. The ground was hard, the air sharp in his lungs. Gus trotted beside him, his breath pluming in the cold. Elias felt foolish. He felt like a meddling old man. She might be angry. She might see it as charity, as a slight against her own ability to provide for herself. He told himself he would just leave it by the door. He wouldn't knock, he wouldn't say a word. He would just leave the wood and walk away, an anonymous gift. He reached the cabin. It was even smaller and more fragile up close. He could see the places where she had patched the walls, the care she had taken. It was a place someone was trying to make a home out of, against the odds. He tipped the wheelbarrow, letting the split logs tumble into a neat pile beside the door. The sound was loud in the stillness. He turned to leave, his heart pounding a stupid, heavy rhythm. "Mr. Thorne." Her voice was quiet. The door had opened. She stood there, wrapped in a thin blanket. She looked pale and tired. The cold had driven her deep into herself. Her eyes, however, were clear as ever. They were fixed on the pile of wood. He stopped and turned back, his hand still on the wheelbarrow's handle. He couldn't find any words. He just stood there, a big, clumsy man with an offering he couldn't explain. She looked from the wood to his face. She took in his worn coat, his calloused hands, the anxious set of his jaw. A long moment passed, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the pines. He saw something shift in her expression. The weariness was still there, but something else surfaced beneath it, a kind of wondering. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. He finally found his voice. It was hoarse. "It's a cold morning." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her gaze dropped back to the firewood, a small mountain of warmth and safety. When she looked up again, her eyes were shining with something that looked like unshed tears. "You're the first kind man in years," she said. The words were simple. They were spoken without drama, without any plea for sympathy. They were a quiet truth, offered up into the cold air between them, and they struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. The first kind man. It implied so much. It implied years of unkindness, of hardness, of men who took more than they gave. It implied a world that had not been gentle with her. He felt the careful walls he had built around his heart crack. He felt the old, settled dust of his grief stir. He had brought her firewood. It was a simple, practical act, but she had seen something else in it. She had seen the intention behind it. She had seen him. He could only nod. He couldn't speak past the lump that had formed in his throat. He turned the wheelbarrow and walked away, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He walked away a different man than the one who had walked over. Back in the warmth of his own kitchen, the second cup of coffee sat cold on the stove. He poured it out. He stood at the window and watched until, a few minutes later, a thin, beautiful plume of white smoke began to rise from the chimney of the Miller cabin. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed and listened to the wind howling outside. Her words echoed in the dark. "You're the first kind man in years." He began to do the arithmetic again, but this time it was different. He was 52. He looked in the small mirror above his wash basin the next morning and saw the gray in his temples, the lines etched around his eyes by sun and sorrow. He saw an old man. She couldn't be more than 30. The town would talk. They would call him a fool. It was not sensible. It was not practical. A man his age should be settling into a quiet decline, not starting something new. He had lived his life. He had loved his wife. To feel this stirring of hope, this protective warmth for another, felt like a betrayal. He thought of Martha. He tried to summon her face, her voice. For 5 years, her memory had been a sharp, clear presence. But now, it was softer, more distant. He could remember her smile, but he couldn't feel it in the same way. The ghost that had shared his house for so long was beginning to fade, and the thought terrified him. He was losing her all over again. He tried to count the reasons it was a foolish idea. The difference in their ages was a gulf. His life was set in its ways, a river in a deep-cut canyon. Her life was a mystery. He knew nothing about her past, about the unkind men, about what had driven her to this lonely place. It was a risk. And he was no longer a man who took risks. A few days later, he was in the barn, sharpening an axe, when he saw it. A fancy black buggy, pulled by a high-stepping bay, was tied up outside Clara's cabin, Silas Croft. Elias's hands tightened on the axe handle. He stood in the shadows of the barn and watched. Croft was on her small porch, leaning against a post. He was dressed in a tailored suit, looking absurdly out of place against the rough-hewn cabin. He was talking, gesturing with his hands, his smile wide and confident. Elias couldn't hear the words, but he could read the posture. It was the posture of a man making an offer, a man certain it would be accepted. Clara stood in the doorway. Her arms were crossed over her chest. Her body was a straight, unyielding line. She was polite. He could see that even from this distance. She nodded occasionally, but there was no warmth. There was no yielding. She was a fortress, her drawbridge up. After a time, Croft's smile faltered. His gestures became less expansive. He straightened up, said a few more words, and then tipped his hat. He climbed back into his buggy and drove away, a little faster than he had arrived. Elias watched until the buggy was out of sight. He felt a profound, surprising wave of relief wash over him. He had been a spectator to a silent battle. and his side had won. That evening he sat on his porch as the sun went down, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Gus came and rested his heavy head on Elias's knee, looking up at him with those patient, knowing eyes. Elias stroked the dog's soft ears. On the kitchen shelf, visible through the window, sat the small, half-empty jar of chokecherry jam. He thought of the neatness of her fence mending. He thought of the way she handled his horses, with a respect that they returned. He thought of the firewood and the smoke rising from her chimney. He thought of her words, the first kind man. Silas Croft had offered her arithmetic. He had offered her a comfortable life, security, a way out of her hardship. It was a sensible, practical solution to her problems. But she had said no. She had chosen the cold, drafty cabin and the hard work over the easy bargain. Elias understood. He had been trying to use arithmetic on his own heart, counting the years, the risks, the reasons why not. But her quiet refusal of Croft's offer was a lesson. Some things had a value that could not be calculated: character, kindness, strength. The quiet dignity of a woman who would rather be cold and free than warm and indebted. He had been counting the wrong things. He looked across the valley at her small cabin, where a lamp now glowed in the window, a tiny star in the growing dark. He had stopped expecting things. He had accepted the silence. But the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a question. He made a decision. It was not a sensible decision. It was not practical. It flew in the face of all the arithmetic. He decided he was tired of being a man who lived only in the past. He decided to walk across the field. The next morning, he did not just make 2 cups of coffee. He put on the clean shirt he usually saved for town. He combed his hair. He stood in front of the mirror and saw not an old man but just a man who had firewood to offer and maybe something more. He walked over to her cabin. He didn't take the track. He cut straight across the meadow, the dew soaking the cuffs of his trousers. He felt as nervous as a boy of 16. He had no plan, no rehearsed words. He only had the conviction that not acting was a greater risk than acting. He found her outside, stacking the last of the wood he had brought her into a neat row against the cabin wall. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Thorne," she said. "Elias," he corrected her, his voice softer than he intended. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her hands, which were stacking the wood with such care. He looked at her face, which was braced for, what? Another offer? Another bargain? "I've been making 2 cups of coffee in the morning for a while now," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "It feels foolish to drink them both myself, or to pour one out." He took a breath. This was the moment. "I was wondering," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "if I might come calling properly." Clara went very still. Her hands froze on a piece of oak. She stared at him, and in the long, silent moments that followed, he felt as if she were reading every page of his life, every regret, every hope. He saw the caution in her eyes, the shield she kept raised against the world. But he saw something else too, a flicker of hope, the same hope he felt blooming, terrifying and wonderful, in his own chest. Finally, a small, true smile touched her lips. It transformed her face, erasing the years of hardship. "I was hoping you would," she said. His heart gave a great, shuddering leap. It was a simple acceptance, but it felt like a new beginning. It felt like the sun coming out after a long winter. He didn't stay long, he just nodded, a clumsy, grateful gesture, and said, "Tonight, then," and he walked back across the meadow, his feet barely touching the ground. That evening he came calling. He sat in a chair she had repaired herself, in a room that was small but spotlessly clean, and warmed by his firewood. They talked. He told her about Martha, about the ranch, about his quiet life. She told him a little about hers. She was from Ohio. She had been married to a man who had promised her the world and given her nothing but debts and a hard heart. When he died of a fever, she had sold what little she had and come west, looking for a place where she could simply be left alone to make her own way. Their courtship was a quiet, gentle thing. It was built on shared cups of coffee on his porch in the morning, on walks along the creek in the evening, on the comfortable silences that grew between them. He learned the language of her moods the way a sailor learns the sea. He learned what made her smile, a rare and precious sight. She, in turn, seemed to understand his long silences, the grief that still clung to him like a shadow, and she was not afraid of it. He took her to the town dance a month later. It was a bold, public statement. When he walked in with Clara May on his arm, the music seemed to falter for a second. Every eye in the room turned to them. He saw the whispers, the raised eyebrows. He saw Silas Croft standing by the punch bowl, his face a mask of thunder. Elias didn't care. He met their gazes with a calm he hadn't felt in years. He led Clara to the middle of the floor as the fiddler struck up a waltz. He was not a graceful dancer, but he held her securely, and they moved together. In that moment, with his hand on the small of her back, he was not a grieving widower or an old fool. He was just a man, dancing with the woman who was bringing his world back to life. He saw Mr. Abernathy at the edge of the room, and the storekeeper gave him a slow, deliberate nod of approval. 1 year later, the Miller cabin was empty again, but this time, it was not a sad emptiness. Its windows were boarded up against the winter, waiting for a young family, perhaps, that Elias and Clara might one day decide to help. Because Clara May was no longer in the Miller cabin. She was in the big house with the wide porch, the house that was no longer too large. There was a simple gold band on her left hand, nestled beside the calluses that had never quite faded. Smoke rose from the chimney every morning, and the kitchen was filled with the smell of coffee for two and, often, the sound of humming. It was autumn again. The aspens on the high slopes were a blaze of gold. Elias and Clara sat on the porch swing, a new addition, moving in a slow, easy rhythm. Gus lay at their feet, his head on Clara's lap, his tail thumping contentedly. The empty chair that had haunted Elias for so long was gone, put away in the attic. Its place was filled. The silence that had once been a vast, echoing absence was now a comfortable peace, a shared quiet that needed no words. Elias reached over and took her hand, her fingers laced with his, a perfect fit. He looked out at the mountains, the same mountains he had looked at every day for 30 years. But they looked different now. They looked like a promise. He hadn't stopped missing Martha. He never would. The love he had for her was a room in his heart that would always be hers. But he had learned that the heart was a bigger house than he had ever imagined. There was room for more than one love. There was room for a new life. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "It's a beautiful evening," she said softly. "Yes," he said, "it is." He didn't have to say more. He didn't have to tell her that she had saved him from a half-life of memory and routine. He didn't have to tell her that she had taught him how to hope again. She knew. In the quiet way they knew everything about each other. She knew. And so the story of Elias Thorne, which he thought had ended, was truly just beginning its most important chapter. He was a man who had learned a different kind of mathematics, not the arithmetic of loss, which only ever subtracts, but the true value of a person, which multiplies everything it touches. He learned that you don't measure a life by the number of years you have left, but by the worth of what you fill them with. He stopped counting the difference in their ages and started counting his blessings instead. It is a brave thing to open a door that has been locked for a very long time. It is a braver thing, still, to walk through it. Elias had been a man living in a museum of his own past, guarding memories and echoes. But Clara May, with her quiet strength and her honest heart, did not ask him to leave that museum. She simply opened a window and let the sun in. She showed him that a house is not a home because of its walls or its furniture, but because of the life that is lived and the love that is shared within it. The world will always present you with arithmetic. It will tell you you are too old, or too young, or too broken. It will give you 1,000 sensible, practical reasons to remain where you are, to accept the silence, to not take the risk. But kindness is not arithmetic. Love is not sensible, and the value of a person who sees the good in you, who accepts the firewood not as charity, but as the gesture of a kind heart, that is a treasure beyond any calculation. Elias learned that the most important sums are not done with numbers, but with courage. Thank you for your time and your attention. It is you, the listener, who keeps this channel going, who gives this voice a place to land. My deepest gratitude for that. I hope you have a blessed day and that you find kindness in unexpected places. Until next time.